Okay, Chapter 4, Sticky Notes, Species Interaction and Community Ecology. The case study is about zebra mussels. So zebra mussels are a very famous invasive species. They're native to Western Asia and Eastern Europe. They arrived on ships who discharged what we call ballast water, which helps ships balance in the ocean. And the ballast water had larvae, and it entered into the Great Lakes, where it found a wonderful ecosystem for it. It spread quickly on land from boats attached to trailers on land, and it's gone from lake to lake to lake. On this page, know what zooplankton is and what phytoplankton is. So phytoplankton can photosynthesize. Zooplankton basically are little animals that are in the plankton. They eat phytoplankton. On this page here, quagga mussel is a relative of the zebra mussel. It does the same kind of damage. We have quaggas in Santa Clarita, in Lake Piru, actually, over in Piru. Also, the figure and caption show you some of the problems with zebra mussels and why they're such an issue. They clog intake pipes, they suffocate native clams, and steal their food, and they're really, really bad news. Okay, know the definition between the difference between intraspecific and interspecific species, and also know the definition of competition from page 76. Page 77, know this figure, which is about niche here. And so this is a fundamental niche, and this is a realized niche. So basically, because of competition, a species cannot occupy all of the food or resources, including shelter, water supply, nutrients in the soil, etc., than it could normally, but competition limits it. And that's called a realized niche. Down here we have resource partitioning. And the reason why it's good for species is because it avoids direct competition. And then you can save your energy for gathering food, or for finding mates, or finding shelter, or running from predators. So you want to really conserve energy if you're a wild species. And so one way you can do that is just to partition who gets what type of food. All right, know this figure and caption up here on predator-prey. We did a lab on it. Know that it's a cycle between predator-prey. Let me fix my page here. There we go. Know the difference between predation and parasitism. So predation basically means hunt, killing, capturing prey. And parasitism is when one species harms another without killing it immediately. Now, a parasite can kill a species, but it doesn't do it immediately, because then it would have to find a new host, and it doesn't always want to find a new host. So down here we have some ways to avoid predation, from crypsis, which we call camouflage, to warning coloration, and to mimicry. So make sure you know those three as well. On the next page, we have some definitions here. Parasitoid is a wasp parasite for bad bugs. Farmers can release those into the wild to kill the bad bugs that eat their crops. Here's another parasite on a fish. All right, so we have pathogen, which is an agent of disease. It could be bacteria, it could be a virus, it could be a protozoa even in the case of malaria. So coevolution is basically two or more organisms that evolve together. And if they get better and better adaptations, like if a bunny runs faster and then the coyote has to run faster in the next generation. And so over time, you have what we call an evolutionary arms race, which means that species get stronger and stronger through better adaptations over time. Know the definition of herbivory, which you can see down here, and that's really easy. It's actually just whenever you eat a plant, it's called herbivory. So if you eat a salad, that's herbivory. On the next page, know the definition of symbiosis, and mutualism is when two species get benefit from each other, like bees and flowers. Microbes in our guts help us digest things. things. Coral and algae work together. And these are all examples of mutualism. Commensalism and amensalism are not in your book, and I don't know why. They were in previous editions, but for whatever reason, they're not in your book. So the first one, commensalism, is when one species benefits and the other has no effect on it, and that can be the clownfish and the anemone. The clownfish gets benefit from the anemone because the anemone has stinging cells and it can protect the clownfish. But the anemone has nothing good or nothing bad that comes from the clownfish. So we say that's commensalism. And then we have amensalism, where one species is harmed and the other has no effect. That could be getting stuck with thorns by a cactus. Now the cactus, you know, nothing good or bad came from it. But you were harmed. So that would be an example of amensalism. And here's another thing that's not in your book called allelopathy. So it's basically a way for plants to avoid competition. And in their leaves, they have a toxic compound or some acidic compound that the leaves drop to the ground and decompose and make soil that's actually bad for seeds to germinate. And this prevents competition under the tree. So oaks do this and pines do this. So you don't have babies, seeds germinating either from your own self or from another tree, and that are going to compete for water or sunlight or nutrients in the soil. And so you want your seeds to germinate kind of away from you so that you're not in direct competition. So that's called allelopathy. On this page we have here a food web. Food chain, actually. This one's a food chain. So we have producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. And you need to know what each level is. This is the first trophic level, which are always producers. And then the second one are primary consumers. Then the third, secondary consumer. And then if you have a fourth level, it's tertiary. Some go to 5, and then you'd have a quaternary consumer. In the now, when everything dies, they get decomposed. So on the water, these are our detritivores and decomposers, and on land, these are our detritivores and decomposers. So we show a chain, and normally when we write a food chain, we don't show the decomposers and detritivores. This one is showing you them so that you know that really everything, when it dies, gets decomposed. So know what the definition of trophic level is. This chain has 1, 2, 3, 4. We do not count decomposers and detritivores in trophic levels. They are kind of off by themselves. Detritivores are also known as detritus feeders, and they're basically animals that decompose or eat dead things, like we call dead things detritus. Here's another term that's not in your book, called saprophytism. And basically that's what detritivores do. They do saprophytism, which is getting food or energy from decaying matter. So that's a term to know, again, not in your book. All right, going on to page 82. So let's talk about energy in trophic levels. So each trophic level contains about 10% of the energy below it. Most of the energy that you eat is lost as heat. We don't say it's the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law says energy is not lost, but it's lost to the ecosystem because ecosystems can't use heat. So it's lost to the next level to be eaten by the next level. So the second law of thermodynamics says that energy becomes a more unusable form as it changes. And so energy in food, if you're a bunny rabbit and you eat grass, only 10% of that grass ends up sticking to the body as bunny body parts, bunny tissue. The rest of it goes out of the bunny as heat. And again, it's not really lost because it can't be lost. It just turns into heat, and so it's lost to the ecosystem. And so one way that we can express this loss is through a biomass pyramid. where basically we lose 90% of the energy as heat as you go up a trophic level. And so really my drawing here is not to scale. The one down here is better to scale, showing you that this level has 10 times more energy than this one versus this one and this one. So it takes 1,000 calories of grass to support 1 calorie of a hawk. And so you lose 10% as you go up a trophic level. On average, that's an average. It's not an absolute rule. It's a close rule that you, you lose 90% and you gain 10% as you go up a trophic level. So ecosystems are not usually food chains, they're food webs. And so here's a food web showing you all of the interactions of how energy is transferred in the ecosystem. So you can see the toad here eats multiple things. It eats the earthworm, it eats the spider, and other beetles and insects. So this shows all of the feeding interactions in the food web. Remember that in a food web and a food chain, energies go toward the predator. And that's important to remember. Okay, the next page talks about keystone species. And so our keystone species, that's kind of the famous one, is off of the coast of California, even up into the Pacific Northwest. And that's the sea otter and kelp forests. Without the sea otter, the urchins eat the holdfasts for the kelp and the kelp disappears. And so without the sea otter, there is no kelp forest. We also talked about wolves in Yellowstone, and without the wolves, the riparian, which means river, ecosystem was dramatically altered. So know what the definition of a keystone species is and a couple of examples. Okay, so some responses to disruption. Well, if an ecosystem is able to remain stable in a disruption, let's say a big old rainstorm or a drought, and it remains stable, we call that it has resistance. If it bounces back readily, like after our drought is over, if our chaparral bounces back once we get rain, we can say that it's resilient. But if it doesn't, and it's severely disrupted, and usually that comes from like a fire in our ecosystem, then it has to go through succession, and there are 2 different kinds. The first kind is primary succession, and this occurs when there's no fertile soil or seeds. So like a volcano erupting and leaving lava behind that dries into igneous rock, that's not soil, and there's no seeds there. Or a glacier receding and leaving behind bare rock. And so the first species that come in are lichen and then mosses because they can grow on rock without soil. And then they die and decompose, and over time they add nutrients and they sort of erode the rock a little bit and turn it into some dirt, and then maybe after a few years you have an inch of soil that's made through decomposing lichen, mosses, and erosion. And then you can grow things like grasses, and they would come next. And then later on you can get shrubs, and then small trees, and then big trees. The second type of succession comes when you have fertile soil and seeds. This would be after a fire or a flood or logging. Here we don't need lichen and mosses. Now they can exist in the ecosystem, but they're not really part of succession. But first comes grasses and herbs come first in that ecosystem. And so we call this secondary succession. Here's where students get mixed up. Students think that first comes primary and then comes secondary. And that is incorrect. Primary is completely separate than secondary succession. You either have primary succession or you have secondary succession. You don't have both. Now there's similarities in it, but they are not the same kind of succession. So that's important to not get mixed up. And we'll continue on with chapter 4 on the next video.